When German prisoners of war reached America, they found themselves in a world far different from the one they had been told to expect. Across the Atlantic, the war had painted a picture of the United States as a ruthless enemy, a place of vengeance, punishment, and humiliation. But what awaited them was something far more complicated and far more human. Between 1942 and 1946, over 400,000 German soldiers were brought to camps scattered across the United States, from the deserts of Arizona to the pine forests of Wisconsin, from the cotton fields of Texas to the rolling farmlands of Iowa. They arrived aboard crowded Liberty ships, exhausted, disoriented, and silent. For many, it was their first glimpse of America. Skyscrapers fading into mist, endless highways, and guards who spoke softly but carried authority. They were enemies, yet here, behind barbed wire, they would experience a side of war few had imagined, one that would test not their loyalty, but their understanding of humanity itself. The U.S. Army built more than 500 POW camps across 46 states. Some of these camps were huge, housing up to 10,000 prisoners at a time. Each camp was designed with military precision: watchtowers, barracks, mess halls, and recreation grounds. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment of prisoners, and for the most part, America followed it to the letter. Prisoners were given uniforms marked PW, 3 daily meals, medical care, and even access to libraries and church services. To most of them, who had come from battlefields filled with hunger and fear, it felt surreal. The prisoners were often astonished by the abundance of food. Fresh bread, hot coffee, and vegetables were available to them daily, something they hadn't seen in years. In fact, the abundance of food in the U.S. was both comforting and alien to them. Many of the prisoners had never tasted such plentiful meals, and for some, it was the first time they had eaten regular, nutritious food since entering the war. In Camp Swift, Texas, prisoners watched long trains roll by, carrying troops toward the Pacific, reminding them that the war still raged elsewhere. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, German officers debated philosophy and politics under the shade of elm trees. They wrote plays, organized soccer matches, and formed orchestras. Even in captivity, discipline remained strict. The U.S. Guards enforced rules firmly, but they also enforced fairness. For some German soldiers, it was the first time they saw racial segregation. Black American guards forbidden to dine with white soldiers they outranked. It puzzled them deeply. To be treated humanely by an enemy, yet to see inequality within that enemy's ranks, it planted quiet questions in many minds. Life in the camps became a strange mirror, a place to reflect on what the war had taken and what it might still teach. As some prisoners moved around the country to work as laborers, they began to witness the complexities of American life. Many were put to work in agriculture, timber mills, and steel factories. They quickly adapted to working side by side with civilians, something they had never experienced in Germany. Some prisoners even joined local American baseball teams, playing games against U.S. soldiers, demonstrating their athletic skills and surprising their captors. By 1943, labor shortages across the United States were severe. Millions of American men were fighting overseas, and farms and factories needed hands. The U.S. government allowed POWs to work, not as slaves, but as laborers, paid in canteen coupons they could spend inside the camp. They harvested cotton in Alabama, picked apples in Washington, cut timber in Louisiana, and repaired roads in the Midwest. For many small towns, the arrival of these prisoners was a curiosity. Foreign soldiers working quietly beside local farmers, guarded by a single American soldier with a rifle slung over his shoulder. Some townspeople kept their distance. Others began to see the Germans as men rather than monsters. Stories spread of farmers sharing sandwiches, of guards letting prisoners rest under the shade on hot days, of music drifting from the fields as the men sang old folk songs from Bavaria or Saxony. By working the land, many POWs began to see America not through the lens of propaganda, but through the sweat of honest labor, the same labor that fed the very country they had fought against. As the months passed, something unexpected began to bloom inside the fences. Curiosity, conversation, even friendship. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, prisoners painted murals on barracks walls, bright landscapes of European villages they would never see again. Some of those paintings still survive today. Letters began to arrive, carefully censored, delayed for months, from wives, mothers, and sweethearts in a ruined Germany. But there were also new letters from Americans who had written to the camps out of curiosity or compassion. They asked about music, about language, about life before the war. In those letters, enemies became pen pals. In Iowa, prisoners who worked the fields were sometimes invited to share meals with farming families. Children would sit wide-eyed at the table, listening to accents and stories from across the ocean. The Germans were often offered home-cooked meals that felt unfamiliar, but were a far cry from the meager rations they had become used to. For many, eating a warm, home-cooked meal with an American family was a moment that bridged a gap they never thought would be possible. Music became a universal language. In many camps, prisoners formed choirs and orchestras. On Christmas Eve, guards allowed concerts. At Camp Concordia, a small orchestra played Silent Night. As the final note faded into the cold Kansas air, both guards and prisoners stood silently. No longer enemies, just men longing for peace. For some, captivity in America became a turning point. They began to question what they had believed, what they had been told about freedom, justice, and power. And though the fences remained, the invisible distance between captor and captive slowly began to disappear. By 1945, rumors of Germany's defeat swept through the camps like wind through wheat. News traveled fast, a whisper here, a headline there, until the day the radio confirmed what many had feared. Germany had surrendered. The reaction was unlike anything the guards had seen. Some prisoners wept quietly. Others stared blankly at the ground. A few cheered, relieved it was finally over. But joy was rare. Letters from home spoke of hunger, ruin, and loss. Cities they once knew, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, now existed only in memory. Discipline in the camps loosened. The fences remained, but their meaning changed. Many prisoners were now waiting, not to escape, but to return. Work continued, but the purpose was gone. They were soldiers of a vanished army, living in a land that had treated them better than the country they had served. For the Americans, too, the end was strange. They had guarded these men for years, watched them eat, work, laugh, and grow old behind wire. Now those same men were preparing to leave. Farewell photos were taken, hands were shaken through the fences. A few exchanged addresses, promising to write when the world was whole again. Then came the trains, rows of boxcars filled not with fear, but reflection. The ships waiting at the docks would carry them home, to a Germany few of them recognized anymore. When the German prisoners finally returned home, they stepped into a landscape of ruins and silence. Some were greeted with suspicion. You lived while others died. Others found no one waiting at all. They had gone to war as believers. They returned as witnesses, witnesses to both destruction and decency.
And after the war, a small number of these prisoners, particularly those who had worked on farms, were given the opportunity to stay in the United States. The U.S. government, grappling with a significant labor shortage, offered some German POWs the chance to stay and work, particularly those with skills in agriculture and engineering. These men helped rebuild America's agricultural industry, and for many, stayed to lead new lives in the U.S. Some married American women and raised families in small towns across the country. In later years, many spoke of their time in America not as punishment, but as education. They remembered the guards who treated them fairly, the farmers who shared their tables, the letters, the music, the small mercies that had survived even amid war. Historians would later call America's handling of German POWs one of the most humane chapters of the Second World War. Though those fences are long gone, their echoes remain in the stories of men who arrived as enemies and left as men forever changed. They had seen both the worst and the best of humanity. And in that quiet realization, between the silence of surrender and the promise of peace, they discovered the truest victory of all: understanding.